Hello and welcome to the Gulf International Forum's panel today on mediators and stakeholders, the Gulf states' role in the Israel-Gaza crisis. This is probably the most, how could I say, timed, affected panel I've ever served on. As we look at what is unfolding in the region, things are changing so fast that I fear that much of what we have to say will either come true tomorrow or be proved wrong. 3 weeks ago, 50 years to the day, plus one of the Yom Kippur October War of 1973, Hamas staged an incredibly brutal but surprisingly effective attack on Israeli towns and villages bordering Gaza. The casualties were horrendous. Too many innocent people suffered. It's estimated that 13 to 1,400 Israelis were killed, and that over 200, according to the Israeli government, or at least 200 have been taken hostage. Israel retaliated, recovering from the surprise. Israel retaliated immediately with airstrikes and began to mass troops on the Gaza border to move in. The airstrikes have continued at a level unprecedented for the region. It's as if it was full-scale war. It is full-scale war for Israel in a sense. 300,000 reservists have been called up to reinforce the 150, 175,000 troops currently in the Israeli army. A huge number. This represents something in the vicinity of 7 or 8% of the population of Israel. And seem to be poised for an attack into Gaza. The human cost in Gaza is now climbing. Israel has declared a complete blockade. The cutting off water, electricity, food, any relief supplies going in. There's been an international pushback to allow relief supplies to come in, and in some cases pushing Israel not to invade. This morning I heard the Israeli government spokesman say that there would be an attack to eradicate Hamas when the prime minister and the war cabinet decide, though the date keeps getting pushed back. There perhaps some commentators say it's because the U.S. has asked for time to reinforce its bases abroad, or it could be because of the very heavy international pressure to avoid more carnage. It could be because the United States is pushing for a pause. Here we have an interesting semantic discussion going on in the United Nations between Israel and the United States on one hand, demanding a pause, and Russia and China on the other hand, demanding a ceasefire and vetoing each other's resolutions over this terminology and other differences. But that appears to be the principal cause. Another problem may be that Netanyahu has to consider the almost certainty that any major attack into the urban rubble of what is left of Gaza will become a grueling urban battlefield in which the Israeli army loses its technological superiority and suffers heavy casualties in a country whose population does not afford it the luxury of suffering heavy casualties. So we are here. I don't know where we are going. We have ideas on what can be done. So everybody else has tried them, and it's a little bit like people saying about the Americans. They inevitably do the right thing after doing everything else first. But we have here a very distinguished panel, all good friends. Mr. Khalil Jahshan is the executive director of the Arab Center in Washington, D.C., and has worked as executive director or president of a number of Arab organizations here in Washington. Randa is a senior fellow and director of the conflict resolution at the Middle East Institute. Dr. Aziz joining us from Riyadh, is a fellow at the Sectarianism Project, the desectarianism project, excuse me, in Saudi Arabia, and focuses on Saudi and Israeli relationships. And then David Pollock is the director of Project Fikra, an organization that is mightily and bravely to develop a dialogue between Arabs and Israelis. So we'll kick it off now with Khalil, please.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank GIF, GIF, for organizing this panel and for inviting me to participate in it with my good friends, Randa, Aziz, David, and definitely with Ambassador Patrick. I would like to, considering the limited time we have for our presentations, I would like to basically jump directly to the U.S. position on this crisis, even though I would like the core of my presentation to focus on some of the Gulf states' response. But I feel that the two are intertwined. Frankly, the Gulf position, the Arab position in general, and particularly the Arab Gulf position, is almost a reaction, if you will, to the U.S. position. So to understand the Gulf positions on this crisis, we need to really look a little bit for a couple minutes on the U.S. policy vis-a-vis this crisis. I would say that immediately after the crisis, which was, as the ambassador just said, very surprising and very effective in its initial opening phase, but it did surprise everybody. I think it did surprise the Israeli intelligence and the Israeli government. It definitely surprised the U.S. government and U.S. intelligence, particularly because U.S. intelligence is so dependent on Palestinian matters, on the Israeli intelligence. So they both were caught blind. But it definitely also surprised Arab parties that are either stakeholders or even if at a distance involved in this issue. The U.S. and the broader Western reaction to October 7, I think, was very swift, very emotional, and unequivocally supportive of Israel, and continues to be so. President Biden characterized the Hamas operation, as everybody knows, as the worst massacre of Jewish people since the Holocaust, and based his policy on that emotional, if you will, depiction of the conflict. He fully declared the administration's unlimited support for Israel and kind of turned a deaf ear. The administration is refusing, in a way, to listen and is ignoring the historical, the military, the political context of this event. That is the 56-year-old Israeli military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, including the inhumane complete siege of the Strip since 2007. Indeed, you get the impression when you deal with the administration that American officials essentially think that the history of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict started at 6:30 a.m. on Saturday, October 7, 2023, and they are refusing to deal with the long years of conflict that preceded it, assuming, I guess, I'm reading between the lines, that they feel that any attempt to understand the background is an indirect way of justifying what happened, which is not the case. I'll tell you, based on 5 separate meetings that I've had with some other colleagues, with senior administration officials over the past few days at the State Department and at the White House, American officials at both have been quite adamant. And these are the people directly involved with the president, directly involved in the policy. They have been quite adamant about refusing to deal objectively with any context at all, any analysis, any rationale, any potential repercussions of the Hamas attack or Israel's response and its impact on the civilian population in Gaza as we speak, citing their unwavering commitment to Israel's need for avenging the attack, that Israel hasn't had the time to satisfy itself emotionally with what happened, and their fear of inadvertently restoring the status quo ante, the fear of returning to October 6 if we do so. In other words, Hamas will stay in power and will come back to rule Gaza. But this position has not been, the U.S. position has not been really kind of static. As a matter of fact, if I look at it, I can divide it into several phases, even though they are overlapping in a way. But there are four separate phases. I would say the first one is the complete shock. The first few days of this conflict, like Israel itself, as I said, Washington and its allies suffered from this deep shock, disorientation, having missed, if you will, that still is unexplained intelligence failure on the part of the Israelis and on the part of the U.S. and other Western intelligence through this unprecedented attack on October 7 by Hamas. Second phase was basically the U.S. As it rallied quickly, essentially focused on a knee-jerk reaction, shoring up shaken Israel quickly, resupplying it militarily, standing by it psychologically fully, without any serious consideration given to its own U.S.-owned complex web of national interests and eroding credibility in a region that was totally and remains totally puzzled by the one-sidedness of the U.S. position on this crisis from day one. The third phase was essentially the administration shifted gears to try to prevent everybody, including Arab allies, and that's where the Gulf comes in, prevent the expansion of the conflict beyond Gaza, particularly on the northern front, in other words, with Lebanon, Hezbollah, Iran, and so on. And that's why this fleet, American fleet, and other troops, ground troops, were sent to the region to kind of prevent that from happening. Yet it is, the administration is persisting in giving Israel a free hand in carrying out what I would call a war of vengeance. This is not a war of self-defense, so to speak. Otherwise, it would have been a lot more targeted, the way Israel did in the past, targeting the guilty party, but not targeting the public. And coupled with, like I said, the show of force in the region that is undoubtedly apt in a dangerous way to drag the U.S. into the fighting militarily and to expand the conflict, contrary to the declared objective of the administration to keep the conflict limited. And the fourth stage started when Biden decided to get so heavily involved personally. I think he is running policy personally. The impression I get from all these 5 meetings with people, they keep going back to the same answer. The president thinks, the president already decided, the president has decided. You could tell that the president is running the show, and by getting involved personally, taking this risky step of traveling to the region, meeting with the Israelis, appearing next to Netanyahu, restoring this love-hatred relationship back to a normal track between him and Netanyahu. I think that is a phase that is continuing and will probably come back to haunt the administration. Now, the Arab reaction is almost, like I said, a reaction to American requesting favors from Arab allies to help with these objectives or the goals of these different phases in the American position. So the surprising Hamas attack, its initial military success, overwhelming the Israeli defenses, and which multiple Arab armies couldn't do over the past 50 years. So all that, I think, got reflected in the initial quiet phase on the part of Arab countries. They were taken aback. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know what to say. It took him few days to begin to act in unison or individually by issuing statements, essentially mimicking the American position, calling for mutual restraint, which they all agree. I mean, there are points of disagreements, by the way. Not all Arab countries have the same position on this crisis. But essentially, there were some common ingredients in a pan-Arab position, mostly, I would say, focused on mutual restraint for all parties, de-escalating the conflict, declaring immediate ceasefire, preventing the conflict from expanding throughout the region, threatening all of them. protecting civilians, releasing the hostages, and eventual revival of diplomatic negotiations to bring about Palestinian statehood, which apparently impacted the president. He seems to be repeating it as of late. But essentially, it's the same pattern, the same narrative, almost mimicking, I would say, the fears and the objectives of the administration. Only maybe one country did challenge the American narrative, and that's Qatar. I think the remarks by the Emir, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, during his annual speech opening the Gulf Arab States Advisory Shura Council, when he said, "We say enough. Israel shouldn't be granted an unconditional green light and unrestricted authorization to kill." That was a departure from all the other Arab positions. The others did it privately. I know they did it privately to the Secretary of State. And that's probably what necessitated the president's trip to the region. But he couldn't fulfill that in the sense that he tried to meet with Arab leaders, but that was canceled before even his plane took off from Andrews base here in Washington. So, as I said, the reaction of Gulf countries to the Hamas attack is not necessarily uniform. Some countries were more assertive than others. In terms of the title of this panel, I would say they all proved that they are stakeholders in this conflict, like it or not. They all have some issues to deal with. There is some impact directly. I would say the most affected is most probably, just again listening to officials at the highest level in this town, I would say Saudi Arabia probably was the most affected, because frankly the core of Saudi and U.S. policy was coming so close to an agreement of some sort. As a matter of fact, I was told by the highest involved people in the administration that only a couple of days after this event, they were supposed to exchange some very serious documents moving forward on the talks that they were trilateral talks, but actually conducted bilaterally between Washington and Riyadh. And there was supposed to be a serious exchange of documents, and that was now put on ice for the time. So I would say, objectively speaking, I think that project is frozen for the time being. I don't know how long. I would guess that it would be short term. There is a serious attempt, including, by the way, this week's phone call from the president to Mohammed bin Salman to kind of, again, keep the contact going in order, when the time is ripe, to resume the conversation. But the only departure from this is Qatar. Again, the case of Qatar was somewhat unique in this case. It's the only one that can be classified as a mediator in this. That doesn't mean it will remain so throughout the conflict or for the duration of the conflict. That could change. But at this time, as we speak, Qatar is the only Gulf country that is playing a mediator role in this conflict based on a variety of things over the past few years. I think Qatari diplomatic agility, small size, the nature of the decision-making process in the country, it's quick, relatively rich experience for a small country with past mediation, regional and international in nature, Afghanistan, Iran, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Yemen, Sudan. It has had a lot of experience in mediating very controversial conflicts, and its ability to respond quickly. And when the administration, that's what I've been told by high-ranking administration officials, when they approached Doha for some mediation based on this, that I meant the factors I mentioned, and the special relationship that they've had with the political leadership of Hamas, the Qataris not only were responsive and quick, but they also were substantive and were ready. They gave some substantive ideas and detailed plans to the administration and moved. And I would say we're about to see the second phase, or the third phase, actually, of this mediation take place within, could be hours. The release of the first two hostages, the second release of two more Israeli instead of international, and now the third phase of all the foreign hostages probably ready to go soon. and it could be a large number. I hear numbers up to 50. So that role might be enhanced in the near future. Thank you.
Khalil, thank you very much for that. If I could add one question to add. Lately, in this case, in the last 24 hours, the tone of voice coming out of the Secretary of State and the President seems to have softened a bit. There are increasing talks about, well, something good has got to come out of this. We have to end up with a two-state solution and stuff like that. How seriously do you think they will pursue this?
Medium seriousness. As I said, our last meeting with the Secretary did focus on that. And he seemed animated and convinced. I can't tell you his words because it was off the record. But I felt that he was serious in basically saying, we've tried to be a bit more vocal on the issue, to look more objective, to look more fair. Apparently, we haven't done the job that we would have liked to do. So expect a bit more of that in the next few days. I'm not taking credit, not personally or the group I was with, but I would say this is what we've been told in all these 5 meetings, actually. And it seems that the administration is adjusting both to public opinion here and definitely to public opinion in the Arab world. That we have a couple of experts on that on the panel. It seems that as we share that information, being one of those polling agencies, the Arab Opinion Index that we do at Arab Center, officials seems to be sensitive to that, and we're conducting a new one now regarding this crisis. So we hope to have results soon for them. But they seem to be aware of where that is thinking. But they are getting also the feedback, frankly, directly from Arab allies themselves, who are caught right now facing some agitated public in these different countries that they've been meeting with.
Thank you very much, Khalil. Randa, we're very happy to have you here today. This is a conflict in desperate need of resolution, and you are the one person whose official credentials mean that you can solve it. So
Definitely.
Please, Randa.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I was asked to address 2 questions. What are the factors that might motivate Iran and its proxies in Iraq and Lebanon to participate in this conflict? And then second, how can neighboring states take measures to avert the potential escalation of this conflict into a broader regional war? I'm going to make a few points in addressing the first question, and then another few points adding to what Khalil said in addressing the second question. In the first question, I think if we take Lebanon, for example, already we have a front, an active front between Lebanon and Israel. It's still contained, but you have, like, on Hezbollah's side, you have tens of people dying on every day. This is, their death toll as fighters is concerned is now about 40% of their death toll in the 2006 war. So this is a very active front as far as Hezbollah is concerned. However, it's still limited, still contained within certain kilometers from on each side of the border. Now, what will make Hezbollah go into, a larger escalation? I think it's what happens in Gaza. A big, large incursion in Gaza is going to make Hezbollah escalate, irrespective of the implications for Lebanon, given the economic dire straits it is in. Part of this resistance axis, which the Iranians have over the years had put together, and you have to give Qa'ani, because he picked up from where Soleimani left off, but Qa'ani brought into this axis much more of an operational, but also much more of a strategic mindset to it. And so you have now red lines within this axis, which is you don't let any member basically get eliminated or eviscerated. We saw what they did in Syria when the Assad regime was political survival was on the line. The difference is that in Syria, they were dealing with militias. So, And still that took a long time, but still, they were able to succeed. I think the whole idea of Israeli objective of eviscerating and eliminating Hamas is definitely meeting their red line. Now, what are their criteria of what makes Hamas defeatable, eliminated, and when do they know? We know that there is a joint operation room that has been established between Hezbollah, Hamas, and some of the Iraqi military factions. And I think ongoing discussions about what's happening inside Gaza is and basically on-time information from Gaza to Hezbollah and the others members will determine. So I think one factor is if they believe at some point that an invasion of Israeli invasion of Gaza will lead to the elimination of Hamas, and I think it's highly, how to say, operationally, it's highly doubted that this is going to be achieved, the objective. But assuming it is, I think they will intervene at a time to create another front to force Israel to divert force away from Gaza and, help Hamas in a way. Otherwise, we're going to continue to see this kind of active front as long as the bombarding of Gaza is taking place. I think another factor that's going to enter that calculus of whether they engage in a larger escalation is how serious they take the U.S. threat. It's easier for them to think about, not easier. They think they can survive a war with Israel, but I don't think they can survive a war with Israel and the United States combined. So how serious they take this threat, I don't know. So if they take it seriously, I think that will be a deterrent factor. If they think they can survive, that it's not serious, that the United States is not going to get involved militarily, that it's mostly in a defensive posture, then, I think that will not be a deterrent factor. The third factor is, again, is the Arab public opinion. I think we have seen now Hezbollah since October 7, really getting its old brand again. When you have protesters in Egypt calling for Nasrallah to intervene in the war, uh, this is a big jump from Hezbollah being a Shiite militia killing Sunnis in Syria during the Syria civil war to now Hezbollah becoming the savior of the Palestinians as they are being bombarded by the Israelis. So this is not going to be it's not going to be, there will not be high weight attached to this factor if we are talking about an equation, but it is a factor they will take into consideration. And again, I think the major factor is going to be how bloody Gaza invasion is going to be, how limited it's going to be. If it's going to be limited to the north, I don't think they will escalate. If it's going to be a larger invasion, I think they will likely escalate if, as I said, those factors are taken, depending on how these four elements are going to be taken into consideration. On the Iraqi side, we already have seen, Iraqi militias affiliated with Iran send drones to attack, U.S. bases in Iraq, in Erbil, U.S. bases in Baghdad, in Western Iraq and in Northern Iraq. And then you have seen them also attack in Northeast Syria. And I think this will likely continue. But however, so far we have not it has not resulted in death. Injuries, yes, but they can escalate to the point of really resulting in death. Again, it all depends on what happens in Gaza. What does Israel do in Gaza, and how the U.S. will intervene after that, if it intervenes militarily. I think that will determine their decision making. Everybody is waiting, but in the interim, everybody is messaging everybody else. Everybody is trying to shape the calculus, the escalatory calculus of the other side. The Americans saying we will intervene, or sending all this, military aircraft carriers and putting Marines in the East Med. That's a messaging to help shape the Hezbollah Iranian calculus about escalation. The Houthis sending missiles toward Israel, drones attacking U.S. assets in Iraq and Syria. That's another message from the other camp. basically helping shape the Israeli calculus as well as the American calculus. So we are in a transition stage right now, and how it goes, it depends on what happens in Gaza. Now, in terms of the second question, what can the allies do? What can the region do in helping prevent a regional conflagration? I think what they have been doing is exactly the right messaging in terms of calling for a ceasefire, pushing for humanitarian assistance to be delivered, sustained humanitarian assistance to be delivered to Gaza, working on release of hostages in terms of the Israeli side of the equation here. I think this is the only problem I have seen is that it's not a concerted effort, and it's more on a bilateral basis, as Khalil said, Saudi American, Qatari American. And I don't see that kind of concerted GCC effort, which if they were to work together, pool their resources together, I mean, they really can position themselves as the mediator. You know, many of them have strong access to Israel, and they can help shape that calculus. And many of them have access to Iran, and they help shape that calculus as well as the proxy calculus. But they need to work in united and in pushing that message, the escalatory messages on both sides. I mean, and I don't know if David's going to talk about that, but when I'm talking with Israeli experts, is that there are basically one factors being considered in the war cabinet is how the next step is going to impact the normalization process, not only the Abraham Accords, which are not going to be upended, but it might be impacted, but also what are the prospects of the Saudi-Israeli normalization and how the next steps taken by Israel is going to impact this. I agree with Khalil. It's in deep freeze now, but the question is it going to be stopping it totally? So this is where I see, I mean, if they were to work in a united front in both, accessing both sides in this conflict, Israel on one hand, Iran and its proxies. The last point I want to make, I mean, I understand the administration saying, there is no smoking gun linking Iran to all of this. It's in our interest to contain this crisis rather than to inflame it. That's fine. But, I mean, you have the foreign minister is basically becoming the spokesperson for all the other parties. He's basically positioning himself as the negotiator of the axis. I mean, he has been setting red lines, making statements, and Nasrallah has not yet made a speech. The Houthis have not made speeches. I mean, the leader of the Houthis, the Iraqi militia, the same. So it's nice to say that they have not been involved. There's no smoking gun, but Khalid Mash'al himself said, the Iranis have provided training, money, equipment. The communication infrastructure for Hamas is very much a copycat of the Hezbollah communication infrastructure. So I think we cannot minimize the role of Iran in this. While I understand the importance of limiting, and preventing an escalation, maybe a hit from Israel on Iran and the reciprocal hit from Iran on Israel, and then we are in World War III in the Middle East. But we really, the main interlocutor right now for the resistance axis, at least in principle, except for Hamas, is Iran. And that's where, again, the relationship that the Gulf countries have with Iran, the fact that Iran is interested and invested in continuing that normalization with the Gulf countries, also give an element of influence and power of the GCC on Iran. So again, they need to work together. I don't see that happening yet. I'll stop here.
Randa, thank you very much. You raised two questions that are of interest to me. I'm not of the belief of most Americans that that Hezbollah is an extension of the Islamic Republic, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, that they are an ally, not a proxy or a client of Iran. How much would Hezbollah's, how can I say this, Hezbollah's calculations differ from those of Iran?
In this case, not.
So
in this case, not. This is an existential crisis for the resistance axis. I don't think it will differ.
That's a scary thought. But anyway, moving on to less. Aziz, thank you very much. Dispense more with running a little bit out of time, so dispense more with the introductions. Please, Aziz.
Thank you very much. Well, it's good to be with you all, albeit on these circumstances. So I'll go ahead and start focusing on basically on two main points on that was touched upon here. Firstly, I think the Saudi notion of leverage and what can it do to bring ceasefire, to bring a ceasefire or de-escalation. And I think then I'll talk a little bit about just the prospects of normalization. So I think, you know, as you mentioned, Ambassador, the 1973 war rhetoric and the Yom Kippur or Ramadan war rhetoric kind of raised the point of whether Saudi will use oil as a weapon again or not. And I think for me, this really begs the question, or this really helps beg the question of, you know, what kind of leverage is there? So I think the leverage really is an interplay, in my opinion, of the stick and the carrot. And so let's look at kind of what kind of the sticks do they have? What kind of things that they could use to induce some sorts of leverage, and then talk a little bit about the carrots and incentives. So I think the sticks, the notion of oil. For me, I think some people even are talking about this, and I think the head of the GCC chairman, he was asked whether or not is oil going to be used as a weapon. And this is clearly, categorically, just a flawed question. I think a question that's most detached from the reality of the oil and the world order that we see now. I don't see Saudi Arabia or others using oil for different reasons. Firstly, I think even if they were, there are too many suppliers out there that make oil not much of a big weapon to use on the United States. And the United States is actually a supplier of oil, not really a receiver of oil. So the notion of oil is not going to work from that aspect. Also, oil has probably never been as important as it has been for Saudi in its history, in my opinion, because this is the last time they're going to use oil to restructure their economy. And therefore, I don't think they will jeopardize that with anything, quite frankly. It's an existential question, really, for Saudi Arabia and whether these projects are feasible or not. So they don't want to use oil at all. The other aspects are these tacit interactions. So, for example, flyover rates. Can they cancel that? Can they cancel, for example, Israelis tacitly visiting in these international events that they're actually not allowed? They're not allowed to boycott, but they could make it very difficult for them. So again, just the nature of Saudi, I think rarely do they ever reject something outright. If Saudi really wants to do something, they create the conditions for it not to happen rather than just say, boom, no, and this is just not how they operate. So that's one thing. But I don't see that very much happening also, because I think it may not have an immediate effect, certainly. The other question is China. Can they really start to show that they're going to pivot more to China? I think this is a long-term question than it is a short-term question. Thinking about the short term, I don't think it will really help ease anything at the moment. So I think this kind of rules out the approach of the stick. And now I think it's the approach of the carrot, the incentive. How can Saudi induce a bit of leverage or communicate its leverage? And I think just the question of leverage is just very important. It's worth just mentioning a few words on this. Firstly, what's very fascinating, I think, about the Abraham Accords is that while it created an inevitable interaction between Saudi Arabia and Israel, it changed the dynamics of leverage. So from before, in 1973 and others, is that what can Saudi Arabia do to induce leverage on the United States in order for them to induce leverage on Israel? The question is not really in what they do. The question is really in what they don't do, which is normalize relations. And given the I would say, the desperation from Tel Aviv. And that spilled over into the political desperation in Washington, D.C. To see a Saudi-Israeli normalization happen, this means that the notion of leverage is very much strong in Saudi Arabia's hands now. It has a great deal of leverage in what it doesn't do, rather than what it does do. And therefore, this is the question now. And I think this is why, speaking to, I think what, Randa said is that, they're thinking about people in the cabinet in Israel. They're thinking about really, well, how is this going to affect normalization? And so this is really the question. I think if Saudi can communicate that, listen, and I won't be surprised if it did communicate this and say, listen, if this continues, then you could say goodbye, or this will complicate the road to normalization dramatically. And so that's what I think has been communicated. And that's, I think, the leverage that is being used to bring about some sort of de-escalation. And then I think the other point, the other point is really, what does this mean really for the prospects of Saudi-Israeli normalization, in particular under the Biden, this grand bargain of his. And I think it's worth mentioning, I think while it was picking up steam, I think it was still pretty uphill. It was, I think, difficult. And I think this made it far more difficult. Now, did it make it impossible? I don't agree with this. I think I agree with what was said here by Khalil and Randa before, is that it is on deep freeze or put on ice. And I think this suits the Saudi approach to normalization. Now, I think a lot of people, just a few words on the Saudi position and how they tend to be, how to deal with this aspect of normalization. Normalization, or the file of normalization, for Saudi is not, they're not proactive in it. They're actually reactive. So Saudi is very good at throwing the ball back in the courts of others. And they're good at throwing the court in the United States and in the court of Israel, and just saying, listen, well, we're never against normalization. And they are right that they've actually not articulated anything against normalization. But I think what the Saudis are good at is they always say, we're ready to normalize when. And we're ready to normalize if. And we're ready to normalize once. So they always condition it. And they have this kind of very interesting interplay of how to condition and incentivize and create, make certain officials leave Riyadh with a very warm feeling about Saudi perception towards Israel. At the same time, while they had a very, they've conditioned it. And one of the aspects of the research that I look into is that how they balance this position. But I think, therefore, I don't anticipate Saudi saying no, not to normalization. But they will then refer to the environment, and they know that the environment in itself is not conducive to a normalization, in my opinion. And I think just lastly, the aspect of normalization here and what was mentioned, I think it was Khalil that mentioned about his engagement with I think the secretary regarding the two-state solution. I think firstly, this conflict, yet again, unfortunately, has reminded everyone that there has to be a political solution, that there cannot be a circumnavigation of the issue. And this out-in approach has proven to be flawed. This peace-for-peace paradigm is just, for me, it's just flawed. And therefore, I anticipate where we could merge the Saudi-Israeli normalization prospects with the notion of the peace kind of two-state solution, or the path to it. And I think this is where they become kind of closer together. And therefore, that's another reason why I don't see Saudi-Israeli normalization, or at least the prospect of it, going away. It's because there is a two-state solution, and Saudi-Israeli normalization is going to be part of that. Now, I think they're going to be closer. But I will say this warning, or I will foresee this. A lot from the Israeli-centric discourses will say, see, this war didn't really scare off the Saudis to normalize relations. Isn't this fantastic? They're with us, aren't they? And that's why Saudi Arabia is very careful and how it articulated its positions, while it doesn't have any love lost for Hamas, it made sure that because of the very sensationalist rhetoric that's coming out from Israel, that any kind of statement that they could make is then going to be instrumentalized as something saying is that there is no daylight between Tel Aviv and Riyadh in this particular war. So therefore, they're kind of having a very, very conservative position, and they win on the other side of the binary. I'll stop there, and then, of course, I'll welcome any questions.
Can I?
Yeah.
I
can hear you.
Oh, can you hear me? Okay, because this
Yeah.
still. Oh, unmuted. I can't. This is a new technology, and it has me completely fooled. One is I started laughing to myself at your description of the way Saudis approach negotiation. I spent 24 years as a diplomat in the Arab world, and one of the things I realized after a time was it is much easier to get a yes out of an Arab government than a no.
Yes, absolutely.
They never say no, even when they mean no. They never say no.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Anyway, I wanted to ask one other question. There's another normalization that's been going on in the background, which is the normalization between Riyadh and Tehran. Where does this fit in what's going on now?
In my opinion, just to say this very briefly, now we're starting to see the benefit of Saudi Iranian normalization. It is precisely because of this situation that the Saudi Iranian normalization is now acting, in my opinion, as a buffer, as a layer of protection in order to communicate to the people in Tehran its original position in Saudi and saying, listen, we are not part of this axis that you are very much against. We don't want to be part of in the middle. And it is precisely the normalization now that illustrates the strategic utility of that decision that many people said what came as a surprise. But now you see kind of the Saudi positioning and the benefit of that. So, you know, I think Saudi's a lot less anxious right now because of this normalization, given the context.
Okay, thank you. David, to prejudge a little bit of your commentary, a little bit of, at some point, you don't have to do it at the beginning, but at some point, if you could talk about the UAE's and Bahrain's relationship with Iran relative to this this conflict. But anyway, go on with what you were going to say.
Okay, thank you so much again for the invitation, and I want to second what my colleagues have said about how sad the circumstances are, and nevertheless we are trying as best we can from the outside to offer some constructive ideas about where to go from here. And I would say that very briefly, first of all, that I am struck when it comes to the Gulf position on this crisis, and particularly those of the smaller Gulf states of the UAE and Bahrain, who are part of the Abraham Accords, who have formally made peace with Israel. I'm struck by the fact that even this terrible crisis and even the really tragic human cost of the war on both sides has not moved either of those governments toward an extreme position, at least not so far, and I anticipate that this will remain the case going forward. In other words, neither the UAE nor Bahrain has taken this crisis as a reason to cut off relations with Israel. And the same holds true of, on the other side of the Arab world, of Morocco. It's worth mentioning as well. And I think very importantly also of Israel's old, so to speak, peace partners, Jordan and Egypt. They are both, although they have many, many issues and many concerns about their internal reaction to the war in Gaza and about the future course of relations between themselves and Israel and the prospects for the Palestinians long term, despite all of those many concerns, their role as at least formally at peace with Israel and cooperating with security efforts by the United States and by Israel, and in their own self-interest at keeping the conflict contained as much as possible, and then moving toward a phase of some kind of better post-war arrangements for the Palestinians and for Gaza and for the region as a whole. All of that has, while shaken, has not been broken, even by this huge crisis. And to me, that is offers some encouragement despite the awful tragedies that we see unfolding around us in Gaza and in Israel every day. Now, I want to focus more specifically, as requested, on the UAE and on Bahrain. And here I want to take a somewhat different tack than we've heard before. And I'm very conscious of the time limits on this as well. And that is to say that I foresee in the future a larger role for the UAE in particular in post-war efforts in Gaza, and more broadly on the overall Arab-Israeli and Palestinian-Israeli front than we've seen in the past. Because I think that the UAE itself and the Saudis and the Israelis and a number of other really important Arab governments, including Egypt in particular, would prefer going forward to see greater Gulf involvement by the UAE than by Qatar in the affairs of Gaza and in the affairs of Hamas in particular, and as a mediator, as Khalil described it, between Israelis and Palestinians and Hamas specifically. I think that there's a growing realization in all of those capitals and in Washington as well, despite some stray comments by American or Israeli officials about the hostage issue. I think there's a growing realization that Qatar's role in this has not been constructive after all, that Qatar is actually a supporter of Hamas, which is to the detriment not only of Israel, but also of many Arab governments and of the Palestinians themselves, as we see unfolding every day in Gaza. And that a continuing major Qatari role in this conflict would actually work to the benefit of the Hamas-Hezbollah-Iran axis, rather than to the benefit of Israel or the moderate Arab governments or of the United States or of the Palestinian people. And so looking forward, I can imagine a future. It's not a sure thing, of course, but I can imagine a future in which the suitcases full of cash coming from Qatar into Gaza, directly into the pockets of Hamas, let's be honest about this, will stop and be replaced by an effort of a more, let's say, judicious Arab coalition of Egypt and the UAE and Saudi Arabia, working with Israel and the United States and other Palestinians in order to finance and supervise a reconstruction of Gaza, not under Hamas auspices, not using all of that money to build tunnels and missiles and rockets and send terrorists into Israeli towns, but using it to benefit the Palestinian people, which they richly deserve. That's one point about the Gulf aspect of this, which I think I want to agree is not uniform, and in fact has some very sharp differentiations. And we may see more of that in the near future. The second thing, briefly, I've been asked to talk about is public opinion and how the normalization issue might play out in the future in terms of popular attitudes in Arab countries and in Israel going forward, how to link normalization with the Palestinian issue. And here I see, I would say also some mixed signals. On the one hand, it's clear from polling data of my own and others that there's been some disillusionment in Arab publics with the Abraham Accords, with the idea of normalization, which was greeted at first by, I would say, a significant upsurge in support to almost half the population in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, or even in Qatar, supporting the idea of some ties with Israel. This has been declining in the last few years, and I'm afraid will decline a little bit further because of the carnage in Gaza. But I don't think that it's irreversible. I do think that as the war is eventually contained and brought to a close and reconstruction efforts begin in a serious way in Gaza, that people can come around at the popular level, not just at the government and elite level, that people in Arab countries and in Israel can come around to seeing more so than exists right now, that there is a common enemy, which is Hamas, actually, and that there is a common goal, which is regional peace and integration and support for the people on both sides of the conflict, or on all sides of the conflict, and that deserves popular support, despite the tragic legacy of what's going on today and of past history. So I am awaiting further survey data about these questions, and I look forward to the opportunity to discuss this further in the future, and look forward right now to answering any questions or comments that you might have, Ambassador, or that others might have in the audience. Thank you very much again.
Am I unmuted? Yeah, I'm unmuted now. I can never tell with this thing. Sorry about that. David, thank you so much. If I could just toss in one comment, in fairness to the Qataris, when we were looking for places to put people, like put the Taliban that were released as a result of the Bergdahl, nobody else showed up.
Yeah, I understand. Right.
Yeah. And so there's been a tremendous reluctance among the other Gulf states in the Arab world.
Yes.
Seen as playing that role.
Right.
So you think that this is changing?
Yes, I do. And I think that, it's going to be messy. I suppose there may not be a clear-cut shift totally away from Qatar. But I do think that there's a growing realization in Washington, in Arab capitals, and most importantly, perhaps in Israel as well, the Qatari role, while it may have served certain purposes in the past, is not going to be a constructive one in the same way in the future. And I think that a lot will depend on the willingness of countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia to step up to the plate, with not just with money, but with active involvement in a post-war scenario, and in cooperation, certainly, with Egypt and with the Palestinians themselves. That all of those things are part of the equation. This is not something that either Qatar unilaterally, or even in some bilateral framework with Israel or with the United States, can determine. And but I think it's a change that is going to be quite significant.
Randa, you were waving your hand, or was
Yeah,
it? Yeah.
I want to say something here in terms of the Abraham Accords, and I think there will be a reckoning going forward. Again, depending on what happens in Gaza, one of the narratives that leadership in the Gulf, those who normalize with Israel, I mean, in fact, the narrative based on two arguments about normalization. One, it's good for the country,
Right.
trade corridors, economics, stuff like that.
Right.
The other element of that narrative is that they will have leverage over Israel.
Yes.
They will be able to influence Israeli decision
Yes.
on the Palestinian issue, which remains,
Yes,
which is now clear, right? Very important for the
Yes.
publics in the UAE, in Bahrain, in Kuwait, in Qatar, everywhere.
Yes.
Well, I mean, the first one is still relevant. Yes, fine, economic benefits, trade corridors, and hopefully they will continue because it's good for the region. But the second, people are going to ask these governments, what have you done to prevent the Gaza bloodshed? What are you doing to, prevent annexation? What are you doing to stop settlements in the West Bank? And so, unless going forward, working with the Americans, they can really provide pathway towards some kind of a political solution. I'm a non-believer anymore in the two-state solution. I think we can talk about it forever. I think, in fact, the Gaza, the Hamas operation Gaza made the two-state solution, as far as the Israelis are concerned, non-viable anymore for the foreseeable future. I think we need to talk about lowering those objectives. What can we get from the Israelis as part of a political, peace, process of conflict resolution and peace building, whatever. Partly it's maybe, having to do with the settlements in the West Bank. That's an achievable objective, stopping that settlement program. That's an achievable objective. Politically difficult for Netanyahu, and hopefully he's not going to be in government in the future, who knows, but it is an achievement, and the Arabs come together, on this. So that's, in my opinion, the dilemma, the predicament of the Arab governments who normalize with Israel, not only the Egyptians and the Jordanians, who have much more of a buffer in dealing with their populations, but with the Arab Gulf, is that, okay, what are you going to bring to the table?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think that's exactly right. And I do think that the idea that we should approach this as a long-term proposition is probably the key here. That we are unfortunately unlikely to see a dramatic resolution of the conflict in the immediate future, but we can see on the humanitarian side and on the political side, we can work for and realistically expect that there could be some progress on a number of different fronts, and particularly on the Palestinian political front. I agree with that. I think that it's something that is going to figure more prominently in the near term than it has in the last few years. We are probably not going to see statements coming from reportedly from senior Saudi officials, for example. I would guess that say that they're more interested in deals made with the United States about nuclear reactors or Iran or weapons or a defense agreement than they are in the Palestinian issue. That kind of thing is probably been eclipsed by this current crisis, and rightly so, in my view, honestly, because this is still an important and emotional and valid issue for Arab publics and for Arab governments. And the question is going to be, Randa, I agree, as you said, how much of this can the Israeli government adjust to in the medium term? Right now, I think it would be too much, honestly, to expect this government, or frankly, any Israeli government, to do to make significant political concessions on the Palestinian issue during the war. But afterwards, we're going to see a different situation. And the Palestinians themselves, I want to emphasize, have a key role to play here. It's not as if they are simply pawns in everybody else's game. they can, if they want to, step up to the plate as well by demonstrating their own readiness to negotiate, to consider creative solutions to these issues, to address humanitarian and economic urgent issues even before some of the political issues can be resolved, to repudiate Hamas atrocities, and so on. This is something that the Palestinians, along with Arab governments and others, can help themselves by doing. And I'm encouraged to see, just in the last day or so, joint statements by key Arab governments that, for example, that do not endorse Hamas tactics, and in fact condemn any killing of innocent civilians on either side. And to me, I would venture this as a final comment. At a recent meeting of Arab and other international leaders that was held under Arab League auspices in Egypt, I was really struck by listening to Ahmed Abul Gheit, the Egyptian Secretary General of the Arab League, denounce what he called, he didn't mention Hamas by name, I'll say that, but he did denounce the threat that Arabs and Muslims face from what he called sectarian terrorists and other militias in their own capitals. And at which point the Emir of Qatar walked out of the room as a sign of displeasure at what seemed to be an Egyptian and an Arab, really, repudiation of Hamas and its alliances with Iran and Hezbollah and pro-Iranian sectarian militias all around the region. So I would see all of that as a sign of at least the possibility of some positive transformations going forward from this terrible situation in which we find ourselves right now.
Khalil, you wanted to say something?
Would like
Khalil?
to respond to, yeah. I'm waiting to be unmuted by the host.
You are unmuted. We can hear you clearly.
Okay, thank you. Several points to make. One, I fully agree that, as I alluded to in my earlier remarks, that the mediation, if you will, or the impact of the different Arab countries, particularly the Gulf countries, is apt to change as we proceed. I do not see a shift in the current mediation to another party. It's a bit too sensitive. As long as there are some hostages,
Yes,
most probably that will proceed.
I agree.
And will take place. It could stop. I mean, I could see some scenarios where it might fail here and there, but it could be also a very long process that could last for a couple of years, if not more, particularly when we get to the soldiers. If there is indeed a significant number of soldiers or intelligence people or what have you that are involved, those will require a totally different set of negotiations that totally unrelated to what's happening right now. So we are at phase 3 in that type of negotiation, and it might take months, if not years, to get to phase 4, phase 5, phase 6. We're dealing with 200 and some already remaining hostages, and it's going to be a long, difficult process. In terms of the two-state solution, I agree. The two-state solution has been dead for a long time. I've said before on previous occasions, the problem is everybody acknowledges it's dead, but nobody wants to pay the funeral expenses. It's a bit too expensive, and nobody wants to take responsibility for declaring or issuing a death certificate. There has to be, of course, we all agree, there has to be future creative solutions of some sort. The problem, look, having focused all my life, having lived for 21 years in Israel as a citizen and studied there and maintained a strong relationship relationships with a lot of people, I can tell you that the problem with lowering the ceiling, which is let's go to practical solutions. The problem with that, it gets interpreted, and this was part of the conversation. I'll tell you what I said, not what the secretary said. I have a feeling the secretaries, the Israelis, are taking the president and the secretary, as we say in Arabic, ماخدينهن على البحر وراح يرجعوهن عطشانين. They're going to take him to the sea and bring him back thirsty. Because the Israelis have a different mindset. It's a survivalist mindset. They see this as a really genuinely, whether we agree with them or not, as an existential crisis. And therefore, they will not accept anything constructive at this time because they are given that chance. The problem is, why should they have the veto? And why should the superpower that sponsors them and rescues them every time should cede to them the veto on these things? There are also U.S. interests at stake here, folks, and we have to account for that. So GC's role will change, I think, particularly when we get, you know how administrations think, Democrats or Republican alike. But this administration in particular, considering the state of the economy, essentially is going to defer to the Arabs for phase 5 of this conflict, which is reconstruction. And that's where the whole GCC role becomes important. GCC united will have a hell of a lot more impact than individual GCC countries. And I'm not sure whether the UAE will necessarily take the lead. They have in the past. They built Zayed City in Gaza, which has been destroyed. It will need reconstruction, and it will need multi-billion-dollar budget for reconstruction. Same thing with the Saudis. But I think united together, they can really have a more, not only solid impact on Israel, but more importantly, on the administration here, particularly if this administration survives in 2024. And it is thinking in those terms. And as a matter of fact, the president is totally focused on this issue. How can I partner with our Saudi partners, as he implied in the phone conversation recently? How do I partner with you so that we can focus on the day after together? So he's inviting the input. And unless the Arabs, and particularly the Gulf states, the powerful ones, get together and have a unified position on that, nobody's going to wait for them. The train is going to be moving so fast. So it behooves them to be ready for that. The shift from Qatar is not going to be, I understand what you're saying, David. There is a public opinion portion in this country, particularly by anti-Arab, let's face it, or pro-Israel, all right? It's very strong, and it's being voiced carefully. Qatar cannot be trusted. Qatar is on the other side, fine. But again, what the ambassador said earlier, Qatar did not come into this business uninvited. Qatar has been asked to do all these favors and has done them faithfully and well. And this administration is more than previous administration, having dealt with several of them, is much more addicted to that, and it doesn't have the energy to take it over or give it to somebody else at this time. Qatar will continue. It might diminish here and there. It depends on the phase that I talked about. But replacing them or taking that position that this current PR campaign trying to raise question marks about Qatar's commitment, I don't think that's going to impact policy soon. Qatar aid today, remember, over the past 10 years has been U.S. supported, and it will come up during the investigation after this crisis, I assure you, because Brother Netanyahu has requested it, has encouraged it.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
And did thrive on it. So it's gonna it's going to be very embarrassing. It's not going to embarrass Qatar, but it's definitely might replace the Israeli prime minister.
Aziz.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you for this great input. Talking about normalization, for me, one of the things that I found very concerning just after the war started, that made me realize a question about normalization is that, two main questions. Firstly, what did normalization really solve? And it goes back to, Randa's point is that, what was the Abraham Accords about? And I'll be very honest with you. I think what we have to do here in the Gulf is to be a lot more clear with what we want from relations with Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Because quite frankly, and as much as I love the UAE loves me, we all love each other, that's fine, that's fantastic, okay? There's nothing against anybody, but I don't think they've been very clear really with what their relations are with about the Abraham Accords. One second it was just like what Randa said, is that this is going to give us leverage over them. And then, Yusuf al-Ateba was a massive supporter of the Abraham Accords, and still is, and how awesome it was and how much, beneficial it was. And then only last month he said, well, we have no leverage to stop annexation. Okay, so all of a sudden, what was this about? One second it was about, really it was for the Palestinians. People are saying this in Israel, in Herzliya, and then all of a sudden in New York, it was never about the Palestinians. So there's, I'm really taking great issue with this because, and for me, I'm really highlighting this because we can't afford to keep dancing around, and we can't afford to keep, being unclear and trying to be ambiguous. I think then this really leads to the next point of, are we ready for normalization? The region that I've seen and the rhetoric that came out and the cyclical dehumanization that's been going on really suggests that what was normalization based on? We're talking about people that, for me, it reminds me, and while I was a kid during that time, but it reminds me of the rhetoric of the Second Intifada happening in the Gulf. And so what did it really solve? The perceptions that these people are having, the things, the slogans they're saying. So the reason why I'm saying this is that I don't think we're ready for normalization. Too many people are focusing on the politicization, the quick political points of normalization of the Gulf, and not really the long-term effort of this. And therefore, this really suggests is that we have to then reconceptualize normalization and the path forward. We have to start thinking about this and investing in the grievances, the old, the core issues of the conflict, and also stop being ambiguous, which is what has plagued many of the misleading peace deals, whether it's Oslo, whether it's even Arab Peace Initiative, which I'm a big supporter of, because the Arab Peace Initiative was kind of done in a way that's so ambiguous, so it was easily rejectable. At the same time, that no, you don't mean negotiation because you don't say it. And so just the whole point is that, we're going to have to start to really rebuild this process of normalization. And when it comes to the reconstruction efforts, that's just one thing, the last thing that I'll say. I think we have to be very careful with how we deliver this information to the Gulf states, to the GCC states, because how they're going to see this. And I'll tell you this, they're saying this is how they're going to see this. Israel is going to bombard this place, absolutely erase it, and we want you to pay for the bills.
Yep.
Okay. This is how they're seeing it. This is how they're interpreting, and this is going to be dead on arrival. Now, if this is, especially when it comes to Saudi Arabia, which has a lot of money, but not a lot of money to spend, not a lot of money to give because they're focusing all this on restructuring their economy. However, there is space for restructuring Gaza if in two ways, done in two ways. Firstly, this has to be linked to a peace process. Otherwise, it won't be, it'll be too much of an ask. Secondly, in my opinion, it has to be linked to regional security. Because I tell you, the perception of the Saudis, one of the things that I've been following the Saudi statements in particular, and is that before they kept on, they were warning. The statements that came out of Riyadh was saying that, listen, we've been warning about this. We've been warning something's explosive that's taking place. Ever since the colorful characters of Bin Gvir and Smotrich entered into the political discussions, the amount of statements skyrocketed from Saudi, the condemnation. Now, and they've all been saying this is provocative. Something is going to happen. Now, they also said that this will spill over into the region. And I think before it was a theoretical concern. Now it's an actual concern. Now we've seen how this is really a regional aspect. So it's viewed from a regional security lens. So if it's framed in that way, then I think you could get a more unified, more collaborative international and GCC and Arab approach. But if it's, here's the bill, you take this and that, it won't go. It just won't. And just the last point on this, there is a stake for Saudi to enter into the restriction bill, because what they're saying is that they can't achieve their very lofty economic goals without a prosperous and stable region. So there is potential here, but it has to be all tied in the right way and kind of harmonized, all in sync, if people remember that boy band. Yeah.
We have really run out of time. I would love to have I'd love to have another hour for this discussion, but we're not going to have it. Let me just finish up with my own thoughts. I tend to slip into darkness and pessimism on these issues. I see right now that the outside world is sort of flailing, sort of picking at the edges of the problem. Why don't you slow down a little bit? We'd like to get some humanitarian aid in. Meanwhile, Israel faces a very serious dilemma. It has two choices ahead of it, and I don't see another way around it. Either Israel does launch a full-scale assault into Gaza and ends up in a bloody carnage of unimaginable proportions, losing thousands of Israeli troops as well as civilians, et cetera, and God knows how it ends. Or Israel decides, I can't do this, bombs Gaza for a couple of weeks more, and then declares victory and reinstitutes the previous state of affairs. I don't see, unless the outside world, led by the United States, wakes up and understands that they created this problem. They, the outside world, created this problem with the Balfour Declaration, with the Holocaust, with the pushing the Israelis into Palestine. All these things together was created by the outside world. And on that note, I will finish. I think it's up to the outside world to finish it. Thank you very much. It has been a tremendously good panel. And like I said, I wish I had another hour. My wife is waiting on lunch, though.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Take care.